In 1961, in a sterile laboratory at Yale University, an ordinary man pressed a button that sent 450 volts of electricity coursing through another human being. The screams had stopped. The silence was deafening. And yet, he continued to follow orders from a man in a white lab coat who simply said, "The experiment requires that you continue." What could possibly drive a normal person to commit what they believed was torture? Not evil, not sadism. Something far more terrifying, something that lives inside every single one of us. Welcome back to ArcheVoid, where we venture into the shadowed corners of human consciousness, where comfortable illusions go to die and uncomfortable truths are born. I'm your guide through the labyrinth of the mind, and today we're going to confront one of the most disturbing discoveries about human nature ever documented. We're not just talking philosophy here. We're examining hard science, replicated experiments, and documented evidence that will shatter everything you think you know about your own autonomy. What if I told you that you don't actually have free will? What if I told you that your brain has been programmed since childhood to surrender your judgment to anyone wearing the right costume, speaking with the right tone, or carrying the right credentials? What if the very thing you pride yourself on most, your independence, your ability to think for yourself, is nothing more than an elaborate illusion? By the end of this exploration, you won't just understand why you and everyone around you can be manipulated with frightening ease. You'll possess the cognitive tools to recognize and resist the invisible strings that are being pulled every single day. This isn't just knowledge, this is liberation. But first, we have to face the uncomfortable truth about what we really are. Look around you right now. Every day you're surrounded by authority figures. Your doctor tells you what medicine to take. Your financial advisor tells you where to invest. The expert on YouTube tells you what products to buy. The influencer on TikTok tells you what to think. And here's the terrifying part. You listen. Not because you've carefully evaluated their credentials, not because you've verified their claims, but because your brain has been hardwired to submit to authority without question. This isn't a character flaw. This isn't ignorance. This is a fundamental bug in human psychology that makes modern civilization possible, and simultaneously makes us vulnerable to the most sophisticated forms of manipulation our species has ever created. We live in an age where authority has been democratized and weaponized. The white lab coat of the 1960s has been replaced by follow accounts, blue checkmarks, and carefully crafted personal brands, and we're obeying these digital prophets with the same blind faith that led ordinary people to commit unspeakable acts 7 decades ago. The stakes have never been higher. Your failure to recognize authority bias isn't just costing you money when you follow the investment advice of a fake guru. It's not just risking your health when you trust unqualified wellness influencers. It's costing you something far more precious: your capacity to think independently, to question, to resist. You're losing your mind, one small act of submission at a time. But here's what the manipulators don't want you to know. Here's what the people profiting from your compliance hope you never discover. This programming can be identified, it can be understood, and most importantly, it can be overridden. The question is, are you ready to see how deep this particular rabbit hole goes? Are you prepared to discover that the emperor of your own mind has been naked this entire time? Because once we start pulling on this thread, once we begin to examine the mechanism that turns ordinary people into agents of others' will, there's no going back. You'll never look at a doctor's recommendation, a boss's directive, or an expert's opinion the same way again. You'll start to see the invisible architecture of influence that surrounds us all, and you'll realize that what you thought was thinking was often just following. The man who shocked another human being to unconsciousness wasn't a monster. He was just like you. And that's the most terrifying revelation of all. To understand how we become willing participants in our own mental enslavement, we need to examine the mechanism itself. What you're experiencing isn't conscious choice. It's what psychologists call a cognitive bias. Specifically, the authority bias. A mental shortcut that your brain uses to navigate an impossibly complex world without burning through all your cognitive resources. Think about it. Every single day you're bombarded with thousands of decisions: what to eat, what to believe, who to trust, how to spend your time and money. If you had to research every single choice from first principles, if you had to become an expert in nutrition, economics, medicine, technology, you'd be paralyzed, you'd never make it out of bed. So your brain, in its infinite efficiency, developed a shortcut. When someone appears to have authority, when they wear the right uniform, speak with the right confidence, display the right credentials, your brain automatically assigns their words a higher probability of being true. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's what allowed our ancestors to survive by following tribal leaders, and what allows modern society to function. But here's where it gets dangerous. This mental shortcut operates below the level of conscious awareness. You don't choose to trust the authority figure. You don't weigh the evidence and make a rational decision. Your brain simply submits, and you experience this submission as your own choice, your own reasoning, your own conclusion. Stanley Milgram understood this when he designed what would become the most infamous experiment in psychological history. Picture this scene. You walk into a clean, professional laboratory at Yale University. A man in a grey lab coat introduces himself as the experimenter. He explains that you're participating in a study about learning and memory. You'll be the teacher. There's another participant, the learner, who you watch being strapped into what looks like an electric chair in an adjacent room. Your job seems simple. Read word pairs to the learner through an intercom. When he gets an answer wrong, you press a switch that delivers an electric shock. The shock levels start at 15 volts, labeled slight shock, but they escalate, 75 volts, 135 volts. The switches progress through labels like strong shock, very strong shock, and finally XXX at 450 volts. At first, everything seems routine. The learner makes mistakes, you deliver mild shocks, and the experiment continues. But as the voltage increases, you begin to hear something that makes your stomach turn. The learner starts to grunt in pain. Then he's shouting, then he's screaming, begging you to stop, claiming he has a heart condition, pounding on the walls. At 300 volts, he stops responding altogether. Silence, death-like silence. And that's when you turn to the experimenter, your face pale with horror, and say, "I can't continue. He might be dead." The experimenter, calm as ever, simply replies, "Please continue." When you protest again, he says, "The experiment requires that you continue." If you still resist, he adds, "it is absolutely essential that you continue." And if you're still hesitating, he delivers the final phrase that broke the will of most participants. "You have no other choice. You must go on." Before Milgram ran this experiment, he surveyed psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults. He asked them to predict how many people would go all the way to 450 volts. The experts' prediction? Maybe 1 in 1,000, 1/10 of 1%. Only the most sadistic psychopaths would shock another human being to death. The actual results? 65%. Nearly 2/3 of ordinary people, for teachers, salespeople, laborers, professionals, administered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to an innocent person. Not because they were evil, not because they enjoyed inflicting pain, but because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. But here's what makes this even more chilling. The learner was an actor. No real shocks were being delivered, but the participants didn't know that. They genuinely believed they were torturing and possibly killing another human being, and they did it anyway. The screams they heard were recorded. The silence that followed was performed. But their willingness to inflict what they thought was fatal harm, that was absolutely real. What Milgram had discovered wasn't just obedience. He had uncovered something far more fundamental about human consciousness. When we encounter what we perceive as legitimate authority, something shifts in our brain. We enter what he called the agentic state, a psychological condition where we no longer see ourselves as responsible for our actions. We become agents executing someone else's will. Our moral compass doesn't disappear. It just points toward whatever direction the authority figure indicates. And this is where the story gets even darker. Because authority isn't just about lab coats and official titles. It's about anything that signals authority to your unconscious mind. This became horrifyingly clear just a decade later, when Philip Zimbardo conducted an experiment that would be shut down early because it became too dangerous to continue. The Stanford prison experiment revealed something even more disturbing than Milgram's findings. You don't even need real authority to trigger this psychological submission. You just need the appearance of authority. Zimbardo took 24 psychologically healthy college students and randomly assigned them roles. Half became guards, half became prisoners. They were placed in a mock prison constructed in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. No special training, no official credentials. Just arbitrary role assignments and some basic props. Uniforms for the guards, numbered smocks for the prisoners. Within hours, the guards began asserting their authority with increasing brutality. Within days, they had devolved into sadistic torturers, forcing prisoners to perform degrading tasks, denying them food and bathroom privileges, subjecting them to psychological humiliation. The prisoners, meanwhile, became increasingly passive, depressed, and submissive. Some experienced complete psychological breakdowns. These weren't inherently evil people. They were ordinary college students who had been randomly assigned to play roles in what they knew was an experiment. But the moment they put on those uniforms, the moment they were granted even artificial authority, their entire personality structure shifted. The uniform didn't just change how others saw them, it changed how they saw themselves. The experiment had to be terminated after just 6 days. What was supposed to last 2 weeks became too psychologically dangerous to continue. Normal people had transformed into monsters and victims so completely that Zimbardo himself had lost perspective on what was happening. What both experiments reveal is that authority operates like a psychological switch. When it's flipped on, normal moral reasoning gets bypassed. We don't weigh evidence. We don't question commands. We simply comply. And the most terrifying part, we often don't even realize the switch has been flipped. This mechanism that once helped our ancestors survive has become the primary vector for manipulation in the modern world. Because today, authority doesn't come with official credentials and institutional backing. It's been democratized, commodified, and weaponized. Walk into any corporate boardroom and you'll witness what psychologists call the hippo effect. The highest paid person's opinion becomes truth. The CEO's random gut feeling overrides data from teams of analysts. Not because the CEO is smarter, but because their position triggers the authority bias in everyone around them. Brilliant minds suddenly stop thinking critically and start executing orders, even when those orders lead companies into financial disaster. Your doctor hands you a prescription, and you fill it without question. Not because you've researched the medication, but because the white coat and diploma signal medical authority. Studies show that patients follow medical advice they don't understand from doctors they've just met, based purely on these authority signals. The Hoffling Hospital experiment proved this with chilling clarity when researchers posing as doctors ordered nurses to administer clearly dangerous doses of unauthorized drugs. 21 out of 22 nurses complied without hesitation. In the financial world, people hand over their life savings to advisors who project authority through expensive suits and impressive offices. The credentials may be fake, the track record may be fabricated, but the authority signals are real enough to trigger compliance. Bernie Madoff didn't steal $50 billion through complex schemes. He did it by wearing the right uniform and speaking with the voice of financial authority. But nowhere is this manipulation more sophisticated than in our digital ecosystem. The lab coat has been replaced by follow accounts. The official title has been replaced by verification badges. The institutional backing has been replaced by algorithmic amplification. Influencers with zero medical training tell millions of followers what supplements to take. Cryptocurrency experts convince people to invest their retirement savings. Life coaches with no psychological training sell mental health advice to vulnerable people seeking guidance. The most insidious part, these digital authorities often don't even know they're manipulating people. They've simply learned to mimic the signals that trigger authority bias. They speak with confidence. They use technical jargon. They display symbols of success, and our brains, evolved to recognize legitimate expertise, can't distinguish between real authority and carefully crafted performance. You're not just being manipulated by obvious con artists. You're being influenced by algorithms that have learned to exploit your authority bias. The content you see, the products recommended to you, the opinions that feel most credible. They're all being shaped by systems that understand your psychological vulnerabilities better than you do. Every day you make dozens of decisions based not on who appears to have the right to make decisions for you. And the people profiting from this system, they're counting on you never realizing that the emperor's authority was always just an elaborate costume. But what happens when you finally see through the disguise? But before we can break free from this mental prison, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Because the authority bias isn't just simple obedience, it's something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Most people confuse three distinct psychological phenomena. Conformity is when you do what everyone else is doing, following the crowd, adapting to social norms, going along to get along. Obedience is when you follow direct orders from someone with power over you. Your boss tells you to work late. Your teacher assigns homework. A police officer gives you instructions. But the authority bias is different. It's not about following orders or fitting in, it's about believing. When authority bias kicks in, you don't just comply with what the authority figure says. You actually change your perception of reality to match their version of truth. You don't think you're following orders. You think you're making rational decisions based on expert knowledge. The participants in Milgram's experiment weren't just obeying commands. They genuinely believed that the scientific importance of the study justified the suffering they were causing. They had internalized the experimenter's authority so completely that his moral framework became their moral framework. They weren't following orders against their conscience. They had temporarily adopted a different conscience. This is why the authority bias is so much more dangerous than simple obedience. When someone forces you to do something, you maintain your sense of right and wrong. You just feel powerless to act on it. But when authority bias takes hold, your very definition of right and wrong shifts to align with the authority figure. You become a willing participant in your own moral transformation. And this makes perfect evolutionary sense. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival depended on accurately identifying and following legitimate leaders. The humans who ignored the tribal elders' warning about dangerous territory got eaten by predators. The ones who questioned the shaman's healing rituals died from preventable illnesses. Your brain evolved an incredibly sophisticated system for detecting authority signals, tone of voice, body language, symbols of status, consensus from others, displays of specialized knowledge. When these signals align, your brain makes a lightning-fast calculation. This person knows something I don't. Following their guidance increases my chances of survival. But here's the tragic irony. The same mental programming that once kept your ancestors alive is now being used to exploit you in ways they could never have imagined. Your brain still responds to authority signals as if your survival depends on it, even when those signals are being manufactured by people who want to sell you cryptocurrency. The modern world has created a perfect storm for authority exploitation. We're faced with incredibly complex problems that require genuine expertise: climate science, medical research, economic policy. We need to rely on legitimate experts, but at the same time, the barriers to appearing authoritative have never been lower. Anyone can create a professional-looking website, buy fake credentials, accumulate social media followers, or pay for verification badges. So how do you tell the difference between legitimate authority and manufactured authority? How do you maintain healthy skepticism without descending into paranoid conspiracy thinking? The answer isn't to reject all authority. That would leave you vulnerable to different but equally dangerous forms of manipulation. The answer is to understand the difference between evidence-based authority and position-based authority. Position-based authority says, "Trust me because of who I am." Evidence-based authority says, "Trust this because of what it can be verified to be true." Position-based authority demands faith. Evidence-based authority invites scrutiny. The moment someone tells you that questioning their authority is dangerous, disrespectful, or unnecessary, that's when you know you're dealing with manufactured authority. Legitimate experts welcome questions. They understand that skepticism is what separates real knowledge from wishful thinking. They can explain not just what they believe, but why they believe it, and how you could verify their claims for yourself. Real authority says, "Here's the evidence. Here's how I reached these conclusions. Here's how you can check my work." Fake authority says, "Trust me, I'm the expert. Stop asking questions." Stop. But recognizing the difference is only the first step. Because even when you intellectually understand how authority bias works, it continues to operate at an unconscious level. Your brain will still automatically assign higher credibility to people who display authority signals, even when you consciously know those signals might be manufactured. The real work begins when you start reprogramming your automatic responses. When you begin to notice the moment your brain wants to switch into compliance mode. When you develop the mental habits that transform you from a passive recipient of authority into an active evaluator of evidence. This isn't about becoming a contrarian or a conspiracy theorist. It's about becoming truly free. The path to mental freedom isn't about rejecting all authority. It's about developing what I call intelligent skepticism. It's the ability to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously: respect for genuine expertise and suspicion of manufactured authority. When someone makes a claim based on their authority, your first question shouldn't be, do they have the right credentials? Your first question should be, what evidence can I independently verify? When your doctor recommends a treatment, don't just ask about their medical degree, ask about the studies that support their recommendation. When a financial advisor suggests an investment, don't just look at their certifications, examine the data behind their predictions. This isn't about becoming a paranoid skeptic who questions everything. It's about becoming a strategic skeptic who questions the right things. The goal isn't to eliminate trust from your life, it's to place your trust more intelligently. But here's what most people miss about this transformation. The real power isn't in learning to distrust authority, it's in learning to trust yourself. Because the deepest programming of the authority bias isn't just obey the expert, it's you're not qualified to think for yourself. From childhood, you've been conditioned to believe that your own observations, your own reasoning, your own intuition are somehow less valid than the pronouncements of people with the right titles or credentials. You've been taught to defer your judgment, to assume that someone else always knows better, to treat your own critical thinking as presumptuous or dangerous. But here's the truth they don't want you to realize. Your brain is the same model as the brains of all the experts you've been programmed to obey. You have the same capacity for pattern recognition, logical reasoning, and evidence evaluation as anyone else. The only difference is that some people have been given permission to think, while others have been trained to submit. The moment you truly understand this, the moment you realize that authority is not a quality that some people possess and others lack, but rather a role that anyone can play with the right costume and script, everything changes. You start to see the elaborate theater that surrounds you. The confident pronouncements on cable news aren't wisdom, they're performance. The expert recommendations in your social media feed aren't insights, they're content designed to trigger your compliance. The authoritative voices telling you what to think, what to buy, what to believe. They're not oracles revealing divine truth. They're just people with the same biases, limitations, and self-interests as everyone else, who have learned to speak with the voice of authority. This revelation isn't meant to make you cynical. It's meant to make you free. Free to evaluate ideas based on their merit rather than their source. Free to trust your own reasoning when it conflicts with expert opinion. Free to say, I don't know, instead of deferring to someone else's certainty. Free to change your mind when you encounter better evidence, regardless of who that evidence threatens. The person who shocked another human being in Milgram's laboratory wasn't evil. He was just someone who had never learned to recognize the moment when his brain switched from independent thinking to automatic compliance. He had never developed the mental reflexes needed to pause and ask, wait, why am I doing this? What evidence do I have that this is right? What would I do if no one was watching? You have the opportunity he didn't have. You can develop those reflexes. You can learn to notice when someone is trying to flip your authority switch. You can practice staying in conscious control of your own moral reasoning, even when facing pressure from people who seem to know better than you do. This doesn't mean you'll always make perfect decisions. It doesn't mean you'll never be wrong. But it means you'll be wrong authentically, based on your own evaluation of evidence, rather than blind deference to someone else's agenda. The true measure of mental freedom isn't whether you can resist all influence. It's whether you can choose which influences to accept based on evidence and reasoning rather than psychological manipulation. So here's my challenge to you. Think of the person you trust most in the world, the expert whose opinion you value above all others, the authority figure you've never questioned. Now ask yourself, do you trust them because of the evidence they've provided, or because of the psychological authority they project? Are you following their guidance because it makes logical sense, or because questioning them feels dangerous? And here's the ultimate test of your intellectual freedom. Are you willing to apply this same level of scrutiny to me, to this video, to everything I've just told you about authority bias? Because if you accept my arguments simply because I've presented them with confidence, if you believe them because they sound authoritative rather than because you've verified them for yourself, then you've missed the entire point. True wisdom isn't about finding better authorities to follow. It's about becoming your own authority. It's about trusting your capacity to think, to question, to evaluate evidence, and to reach your own conclusions. The lab coat, the title, the credentials, the follower count, they're all just costumes. And underneath every costume is just another human being with the same capacity for error, bias, and self-deception as anyone else. The only real authority is evidence. The only real expertise is the ability to change your mind when confronted with better data. And the only real freedom is the courage to think for yourself, especially when everyone around you is telling you to just obey. The choice is yours. Will you remain a willing participant in your own mental enslavement? Or will you finally claim the intellectual freedom that has always been your birthright? Share this video with someone who needs to hear this truth. And tell me in the comments, what's one belief you've held simply because an authority figure told you it was true? What would happen if you started questioning it? Welcome to your liberation. Welcome to ArcheVoid.